समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
How many times you might remember I've used the expression reporter's luck. Reporter's luck, when you are in this business, my business, then sometimes things happen to you serendipitously. You run into big stories, you catch a conversation, somebody tells you something, so you just end up being in the right place at the right time in terms of news value. It may not be a very good time for those affected by it, but in terms of news value. That is reporter's luck. You will also find that I've also used it often in my episodes of first person, second draft. However, this is Cut the Clutter. And this is Cut the Clutter over what is now making waves not just all over Washington and in the US, but also across the world, among America's allies, but also among America's adversaries. Because the American top security officials, including the Vice President, National Security Advisor, Head of CIA, Director of CIA, Director of National Intelligence, all of them, they've been caught talking on Signal, which is an encrypted app. In fact, this whole story is a very good advertisement for Signal. A lot of people in India, including in the government now, use Signal because they want to keep confidentiality, and nobody is quite sure whether WhatsApp is safe or not. So Signal is everybody's choice. WhatsApp, Telegram are out. So on this chat has now leaked and we will talk about it. But let me try and put this in perspective for you first, since I talked about reporter's luck. So let me take you back. It's all theoretical, right? If I had a time machine, I will take you back to 14th of February 2019. That's about 5 years back. If I take you back there, why is that date important? That's the day the Pulwama suicide attack took place on the CRPF bus, right? On that day, I'm quite sure at the highest levels of Indian security establishment, there must have been discussions and plans to take retribution, that you cannot let this go unpunished. Something has to be done. In fact, just after that, in the same week, I had written a national interest, of which I'm sharing a link with you. You can also see it on your screens, where I said Pakistan has made a big mistake if they believe that India will let it go, or Modi government will let it go without retribution. There will be an Indian military response to this. That much we could anticipate, so I can say, all right, I got it right. But if you were a journalist, maybe by 15th or by 16th, maybe by 15th, within a day, India's topmost security officials, National Security Advisor, the chiefs of the defense forces, right, the intelligence heads of the intelligence agencies, maybe the governor of Jammu and Kashmir, maybe the DGP of Jammu and Kashmir, whoever was in the picture, the Indian Air Force, particularly the relevant Indian Air Force command from which these aircraft were to be brought in, they were all discussing these matters and deciding on their plans and timings of the attack. And they were doing it on an encrypted app, say the Signal app. And by mistake, somebody added an Indian journalist, an Indian editor, maybe a reporter editor, an editor who's also a byline, right? What will that happen? Will you call it reporter's luck, or will you call it reporter's dilemma? It's reporter's luck because you got a great story, right? But it's also reporter's dilemma. You've got this story, but do you publish it before you know that your government is going to carry out these attacks? These are top secret. Lives of those involved in the attacks will be at stake, and also there will be action on the ground, because there will be impact of these bombs wherever these bombs are dropped. And there is there is national interest involved in this. So will you carry that story? Now, most certainly, you will not carry that story. But once the operation is over and you think everything is safe and this thing is, nobody's life is going to be endangered, then it becomes a fantastic story. It's a great story because you were brought in sort of, I won't even say serendipitously, you were brought in stupidly by an enormous error of judgment into a chat group that is discussing top level operational plans involving your armed forces and an imminent attack within 5 days. That's precisely what happened. In fact, if you count the days, the gap is exactly that much. 11th of March, Jeffrey Goldberg. Now, Jeffrey Goldberg is not a nobody. He's been the editor of Atlantic for 9 years. He is also a very serious byline, particularly when it comes to writing about the Middle East. So he's done landmark work on Hezbollah. In fact, if you want to write about the Hezbollah or research on the Hezbollah, as I did when I was preparing for the Cut the Clutter that I did on Hezbollah, I read up his 2 articles in New Yorker magazine, The Party of God. So he is an authority on that region. Also in 2002, he wrote a brilliant piece on Saddam Hussein's use of chemical weapons against the Kurds in Halabja. I hope I pronounced that right. But you remember that incident, 2002, that happened. And that was his story as well. And he knows the Middle East very well. And it isn't just the Middle East. See, he's writing on Pakistan. See, the ally from hell, right? This is a December 2011 piece on Pakistan and Pakistan's nuclear arsenal. He's also somebody the Trump administration does not like. They don't like him. They don't like the Atlantic, which has been very critical of not just Trump administration. Trump administration is quite new. It's only been there for 2 months, but it's also been critical of Trumpian politics and of Republicans in general. Now, he got added to this group. On the 11th, he gets an invitation from the US National Security Advisor to join a group on Signal. So he says, I'm taken aback. Please see his first article, his account of how he got added to the group. He first got taken aback that maybe this is some nefarious character who's trying to trap me into something, because these days a lot goes on. Somebody sends you an email or puts you in a group saying you're winning this great prize or great something, or you're getting this for free, you're getting that for free, you're getting 99% discount if you give me just 1%. So, and a lot of this is done to ruin reputations as well. So there is a lot of those disinformation traps that are now set up, particularly if you are famous or if you are controversial or if you live in a polarized environment, which all of us journalists do. Because for any number of people who might like what we do, there is a large number of people who don't like what we do. So some of them might decide to take you down. So he said that was his fear as well, but he decided to just watch it and play along. Then 2 days later, he gets an invite again to say now a group is being set up. And in this case, he sees the group coming into place. And look at the group. What he's done now is he's now released all these screenshots of the conversations on this group. It's almost as if 2/3 of the Trump cabinet is there. At least his entire security cabinet is there. So see Michael Waltz, NSA, who's the administrator of the group. Then second, because this is a screenshot from Jeffrey Goldberg's phone, it says you, so that is Jeffrey Goldberg, but in the chat group, he's there as JG. How do we know this? Because that's the question that the senators asked at the hearing. That didn't you notice? Did any of you note the initials JG and ask the question as to who's this JG, who's overhearing all this but not participating in it? And there was no answer. So JG, that's you. That's JG. See that list on your screen. Scott B is Scott Bessent, Secretary of Treasury, Finance Minister. Pete Hegseth, Secretary of Defense. Marco Rubio, Secretary of State. John Ratcliffe, Director CIA. Susie Wiles, Chief of Staff at the White House. Then TG is Tulsi Gabbard. J.D. Vance, Vice President, and Steve Witkoff, who's the Special Envoy to Middle East on behalf of the President of the US, who at that point was in Moscow. Steve Witkoff is the US President's special envoy to the Middle East. At that point, he was in Moscow. So this also came up at the Senate hearing, where one of the senators asked these intelligence chiefs that, do you realize that Steve Witkoff was participating in these conversations while he was in Moscow, and which could leave him particularly vulnerable to eavesdropping. And what happened? What would have happened if the Houthis found out the exact time when your planes were arriving? Maybe they would have moved their air defenses there. Could have cost lives of American soldiers, and also could have led to a mission failure. The senators also asked Tulsi Gabbard if she was overseas when these conversations were going on, and she said yes. And then they asked her, which phone were you using? Were you using your personal phone or an official phone? That's a question she refused to answer. She hedged it. She said, these are things being investigated by National Security Council, so I'd rather not get into it. But once again, senators on the committee said that we will discuss it behind closed doors. But they kept on saying that if this stuff is classified, then why were you discussing it on a chat group and in such a reckless manner that you had an outsider, a journalist on it? And second, if it is not classified, why aren't you releasing the transcripts? It is because they kept on saying it's not classified, it's not classified, and they also kept on attacking the journalist. That's the reason that journalist Jeffrey Goldberg then decided to release the entire conversation with screenshots, and you will see those screenshots as we've been speaking. Now, I have the screenshots with me, and you will see some running, but there will be some important points that emerge from these screenshots. Number one, there is a loathing of Europe. There is a loathing of Europe. How do we know that? That's because I heard the entire 1 hour, 57-minute Senate Intelligence Committee hearing on this particular issue. That hearing was supposed to be on the US intelligence community's annual threat assessment report, ATA. However, that became secondary to the conversation because all of the senators on the committee, particularly those from the Democratic Party, including the Vice Chairman, Mark Warner from Virginia, Democrat, all of them basically spent all their time raising questions on this sort of leaked chat or this disaster of bringing a journalist, also a critical journalist in this case, in a chat which involved operational planning. How this was done, read Jeffrey Goldberg's first article. That first article is headlined, The Trump administration accidentally texted me its war plans. In the first article, in fact, he starts out by saying the Trump administration accidentally texted me its war plans. That's the headline. And then the blurb tells you the US national security leaders included me in a group chat about upcoming military strikes in Yemen. I did not think it could be real. Then bombs started falling. Now, he gets added to this group, and then he again sees these messages coming in, and he's still not sure this is for real. Then 11:44. Now we have come to March 15th. I told you the gap is about the same as between the Pulwama attack and the Indian bombing attacks in Balakot. So it's as if a journalist had been leaked the plans to bomb Balakot 5 days earlier. Not just leaked the plans, but had been put on a group chat that was discussing it on minute-to-minute basis, right? So first of all, I will just read out to you the message he gets from Michael Waltz, who's the National Security Advisor, setting up the group. And on that message, he says, team, establishing a principals group for coordinating on Houthis, particularly over the next 72 hours. My deputy, Alex Wong, is pulling together a tiger team at deputies/agency chief of staff level, following up from the meeting in the situation room, situation room, this morning for action items, and will be sending that out later this evening. That is how this group started. And he goes on thinking that maybe this is not for real, maybe this is a joke, maybe somebody is trying to trap me, maybe somebody thinks that I will jump with this saying, oh, fantastic, I've got a scoop, and then somebody will say, ha, gotcha, pakad liya, बेवकूफ बनाया तुमको, टोपी पहनाया, चने के झाड़ पे चढ़ाया, whatever you want to say. So he was still concerned. And he says all this while conversations are going on involving the Vice President, J.D. Vance, Pete Hegseth, Secretary of Defense, etc., etc. And yet he's just watching it because he's not sure. This could all be made up because bad guys or people who want to take down reputations are very smart these days. And there is also artificial intelligence. People can sound like somebody. People can make spelling mistakes like somebody. People are very smart. So this guy is also, he's no bacha, he's 60 years old, and he's seen wars both as a journalist and as a soldier. I will tell you more about Jeffrey Goldberg as we go on. On 15th of March at 11:44 Eastern Time, that is say New York time, Washington time, 11:44, he gets an update again on this Signal group. The group is called Houthi PC Small Group. Houthi PC Small Group. PC in this case stands for Principal Committee, but Houthi PC Small Group. Now on this group, suddenly something interesting comes up which Jeffrey Goldberg notices. And that is an update from Pete Hegseth, Secretary of Defense. And that update is at 11:44 a.m. Weather is favorable, just confirmed with CENTCOM. CENTCOM is Central Command of US Armed Forces, which looks after the Middle East. Just confirmed with CENTCOM, we are a go for mission launch. At 12:15, and in the same message, it says 12:15 F-18s launch first strike package. That means at 12:15 the first set of F-18s will launch. Obviously, most likely from an aircraft carrier in that region, they will be launched, and that will be the first strike package. Then it says 13:45. By that time, these aircraft will reach the target. Obviously, by 13:45. Trigger-based. I don't know what trigger-based means. Maybe what it means is when somebody down below, who's their informant, tells them that the target is surely in some place. Trigger-based F-18 first strike window starts. Target terrorist is at his known location, so should be on time. Also, strike drones launch MQ-9. So he's giving all details of aircraft to be used, the time, and also the weapon systems in this case MQ-9 drones. Then in the same message it says 14:10, 2:10, that is 2:10 p.m. more F-18s launch, second strike package. And then at 2:15 it says 14:15 strike drones on target. This is when the first bombs will definitely drop pending earlier trigger-based targets. And 15:36, he mentions precise timing. F-18 second strike starts. Also, first sea-based Tomahawks are launched. So this is really like teenagers who are playing war games on video, because that's the kind of enthusiasm you see, and that's the kind of detail you see being discussed on a Signal chat. So at the Senate Intelligence Committee hearings, there was a lot of questioning of whether it's even safe. Forget the fact for a moment that a journalist got added to the chat. That's your stupidity. But is it even proper to have these discussions on this kind of chat groups, which are not proprietary to the US government or the armed forces or the CIA, to which all of those appearing there, including the CIA chief, John Ratcliffe, the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, all of them said that, look, this is considered to be safe. In fact, the CIA chief said, when I took over at CIA, which was just about a month and a half ago, I saw the records that tell me that the CIA considers Signal to be safe for these conversations, and I found Signal preloaded on my CIA official computer. However, all this is being discussed on Signal, and this message ends with something really juicy. This message from Pete Hegseth ends, more to follow per timeline. We are currently clean on OPSEC. That means my operational security is absolutely clean. There's been no leakage. The fact is there is a leakage, except in this case, this editor is responsible and he's chosen not to make a story of it as yet. And then he says, Godspeed to our warriors. And J.D. Vance response to that, Vice President saying, I will say a prayer for victory. At which point Jeffrey Goldberg said that I got interested. This is 11:44. According to this, bombs should drop somewhere in the Houthi areas in the next hour and a half or so. So he decides to wait in the parking lot of the supermarket where he's been shopping. So he waits in the parking lot, and while he's whiling away time, he checks out social media, and around 2 p.m. New York time, on cue, he finds social media a buzz because he's obviously searching for Yemen and Houthis, that bombs are falling in Sana'a, the capital of Yemen. That is when he is sure what he was made part of was a real top security American intelligence and military group planning an imminent operation, and he was now watching this operation or following this operation in real time. How lucky can a journalist get? And then when the government, when the establishment tries to poo-poo him, first the Secretary of Defense said he's a so-called journalist who has an agenda, useless, discredited. That's how Trump administration usually, in fact, these days increasingly most governments will treat journalists who do stuff that is not flattering them or that is not sucking up to them. These days governments are not even happy if you don't question them or if you don't bother them. You have to be actively praising them and actively shilling for them. If you don't do that, you can be the recipient of much abuse. In this case, you can imagine, because these principles in the new US national security system had been exposed so badly by their own stupidity that they started attacking him. Now, at the Senate hearings, one senator after another, particularly from the Democratic Party, and these were all people of substance, because Senate Intelligence Committee is serious business. They kept on repeating the same question, and especially of Tulsi Gabbard again and again. That's because this hearing was for the annual threat assessment of the US intelligence community, what's sometimes called IC. And she heads the US Intelligence Committee. So this was actually her presentation. And she was the leader of the group, although Kash Patel was there also. Other key people from the intelligence organizations were there. As we understand, the US has 18 intelligence organizations. Those we'll talk about on some other day. Now, the question repeatedly asked was this chat that you had on Signal, was this classified or not, right? And she kept on saying this is not classified. And then the CIA chief also generally said, looks like it's not classified. I don't know, because the right to classify this or declassify this lies with the Secretary of Defense. Somebody said the right lies right up to the Commander-in-Chief, to the President. The President can declare anything to be not classified. One of the Democratic senators also said that, there is something called CUI. That is something I heard for the first time, by the way, from this hearing. CUI is controlled unclassified information. That you might have information which has not been classified, which is not marked top secret, but it is still controlled, which means it's for internal use. So don't you think this even qualifies to be in that category? At which point all of the witnesses, as they are called, from the US intelligence community, all the leaders who were there at the hearing, they were blank, and they said there'll be an inquiry, etc. We'll see. And the senators on the committee said that we will take it forward in the next part of our hearing, which will be in camera or which will be behind closed doors. So the question again was, how could you discuss all of this on Signal, on an encrypted app, which how are you so sure somebody will not have access to it? And then how could you be so reckless as to admit a journalist to it? Now, you might say he's a useless journalist, he's stupid, but if you think he's stupid and he's hostile to you and he has an agenda to bring down the Trump administration, that's all the more reason why he should not be on this chat. So I see a lot of conspiracy theories. I also see lots of other explanations that maybe this was deliberately done to give the Europeans a message, etc., etc., etc. But remember, there is a principle I've always followed. It's a good principle. I will tell you from experience. Don't search for conspiracies or any theories to explain what can be easily understood as simple, old-fashioned stupidity. which seems to have happened in this case. So some points emerge from these screenshots. Number one, I'm just breaking it down into 5. Number one is the loathing of Europe. Now, loathing of Europe comes in when J.D. Vance features in this. J.D. Vance features in this because J.D. Vance is in Michigan while this is being carried out. And J.D. Vance comes in to say, team, I am out for the day doing an economic event in Michigan, but I think we are making a mistake. So he's the first one to say that maybe this operation right now is a mistake. He says 3% of US trade runs through the Suez. Please see on your screen. 3% of US trade runs through the Suez. 40% of European trade does. There is a real risk that the public doesn't understand this or why it's necessary. What it means is that 40% of Europe's trade is going there, not ours. So why are we doing this? For Europe's sake. And then he goes on to say, I'm not reaching the conclusion that this shows a loathing of Europe, because loathing of Europe now has been quite evident since Trump administration came in. But also see what's being said here, because the same message he goes on to say, J.D. Vance, the strongest reason to do this is the strongest reason to do this is, as Porter said, to send a message. But I am not sure the president is aware how inconsistent this is with his message on Europe right now. There is a further risk that we see a moderate to severe spike in oil prices. I am willing to support the consensus of the team and keep these concerns to myself, but there is a strong argument for delaying this a month, doing the messaging work on why this matters, seeing where the economy is, etc. Then Joe Kent, who's one of the deputies, he joins in and he says there is nothing time sensitive. Driving this time, we can take time, and says, but some things can happen. The Israelis will likely take strikes on their own and therefore ask us for more support to replenish whatever they use against the Houthis. So why don't we use it ourselves? So Israeli use karenge to unka replace karna padega, right? But that's a minus factor. And then he said, I will also send you some more data, etc., etc. Then Pete Hegseth responds to J.D. Vance. Stay with me on the loathing for Europe question. Pete Hegseth says, I understand your concerns and fully support you raising with POTUS important considerations, most of which are tough to know how they play out: economy, Ukraine, peace, Gaza, etc. I think messaging is going to be tough no matter what. Nobody knows who the Houthis are. Who cares? Nobody knows who the Houthis are, which is why we would need to stay focused on, one, Biden failed, and second, this is Iran funded, right? So you have to find an enemy at home and an enemy overseas. And Houthis, nobody knows, so Houthis don't look like an enemy worthy of this kind of action. And then he says, you can take time. No problem, and I can keep secrecy. And this is about two things: restoring freedom of navigation, which is a core national interest, and re-establishing deterrence, which Biden cratered. And he says, but we can always take time, and I can promise you 100% operational security. Ha ha ha. You can have a laugh, I can have a laugh, because the operational security had already been compromised. It's just that the editor who was getting this stuff was not leaking it or using it as a story. Then Michael Waltz comes in. He's the national security advisor. He says the trade figures we have are 15% of global and 30% of container traffic goes through the Red Sea and Suez Canal. So it's not as if 40% of all Europe and only 3% of America. It is difficult to break that down to the US, he says. And he says, whether we pull the plug or not today, European navies do not have the capability to defend against the type of sophisticated anti-ship cruise missiles and drones that the Houthis are now using. So whether it's now or several weeks from now, it will have to be the United States that reopens the shipping lanes. Per the President's request, we are working with Department of Defense and State to determine how to compile the cost associated and levy them on the Europeans. Which makes my second point that comes from the first, that this American administration is very transactional on security. So they see American military power as a kind of a protection racket. That you have a problem, we can come and solve it for you, even if you're our allies, right? But you will have to pay for it. So he's already saying that he's setting up a system to run up a bill. to run up a bill that will be presented to somebody. From a messaging standpoint, there are some typos there, but he says from a messaging standpoint, we must make sure that this is given out as the reason why the Europeans must invest in their defense. So once again, a loathing of Europe. It gets worse, by the way, as we go on. Pete Hegseth now says, JD Vance now says, addressing Pete Hegseth, if you think we should do it, let's go. I just hate bailing out Europe. To which Pete Hegseth, Secretary of Defense, says, I fully share your loathing of European freeloading. It's pathetic. And that's pathetic, as you can see, is in all capitals. So when I chose the description loathing, I wasn't inventing it. It was taken from this conversation. And then he says, but Mike is correct. Mike, as in the NSA, we are the only ones on the planet on our side of the ledger. What does that mean? That means maybe the Chinese can do it, but they are the other side of the ledger, right? Ek taraf debit, ek taraf credit, right? So we are the only ones on our side of the ledger who can do this. Nobody else even close. Question is timing. And then Steve Miller, who is a key figure in the White House, he's saying, as I heard it, the president was clear, green light, but we soon make clear to Egypt and Europe what we expect in return, right? Those are the two entities that will benefit most from the reopening of the Suez Canal. So we must make clear to Egypt and Europe what we expect in return. We also need to figure out how to enforce such a requirement. For example, if Europe doesn't remunerate, that means if the Europeans don't pay up, then what? If the US successfully restores freedom of navigation at great cost, there needs to be some further economic gain extracted in return. So once again, when I said the second point that there is now an extractive core to American use of military power, I was not pulling that bird out of thin air. It's taken out of this conversation. The rest I told you earlier, that is when the operational details start, when Peter Hegseth starts talking 1144 onwards. However, other points follow from this. The third point is that this lot is functioning like a teenage boys club, which has got these expensive and really dangerous toys. And they think they can use them. In this case, they are also using against stateless entities, right? So there is nobody to question them. I told you I'll tell you something more about Jeffrey Goldberg. Now, Jeffrey Goldberg is also difficult for the American right also to attack, particularly in the context of the Middle East, because not just has he been one of the finest reporter writers on the Middle East, he's Jewish, who's kept on going back to Israel. He also went back to Israel after his graduation from Pennsylvania. He also went back to Israel to join the Israeli army and served as a prison guard at one of the prisons during the first Intifada. And that prison was holding those arrested in the first Intifada. So he served time as a prison guard, as an Israeli army prison guard. Then he came back, he worked in America, he went back to Israel, worked at Jerusalem Post, came back and worked in America. So one, not only does he know the system, but he's also somebody who's Jewish and who's fought for Israel personally. So there are limits to how much muck anybody can throw at him and what kind of motives can be imputed to him. In fact, before he published these conversations finally, he says in his accompanying piece, which I am sharing with you, please see it on your screen also, he says that they wrote to the White House, they wrote to the CIA, they wrote to the NSA's office to ask if they had any objections, because they had said there was nothing classified in these conversations, if they had any objections, if they published the entire conversations. Others, he said, did not get back. The CIA simply said that don't publish the name of the deputy or some assistant or some aide of the CIA chief, John Ratcliffe. The CIA said, please don't mention his name because we don't like CIA operational level officers' names to be made public. They got an email from White House spokesperson who's very familiar, Caroline Leavitt, and she said in that email, as we have repeatedly stated, there was no declassified information shared in the group chat. However, as both CIA director and NSA have expressed today, that does not mean we encourage the release of the conversation. This was intended to be an internal and private deliberation amongst high-level senior staff, and sensitive information was discussed. So, for those reasons, yes, we object to its release. However, this was not to say because they did not insist it was declassified, The Atlantic went along and published it. Now, after this, we've seen the first admission from Donald Trump. So, speaking to one of the right-wing channels, Newsmax, he said yes, something happened. No big deal. He says yes, this should not have been discussed, vagara vagara, but this was not classified. But he does go on to admit that this is the only glitch in my first 2 months. So for Donald Trump also to admit that this was a glitch, and in fact the first glitch of his 2 months, is not such a small deal. It is quite a sizable deal. And you remember in old days, you have to be a little bit older. I think if you're about 40 or older, you will know that there used to be a column in the newspapers called Stop Press. That is when the paper had started to print and suddenly a news broke. So they will stop the printing on the front page, take out some little item and put a little highlight saying Stop Press. That means this happened. It was so important that we had to stop our presses from printing further copies and add this. So something like that has happened. Just as I have finished this episode, I see just as I finished this episode, I have seen a statement released by the Pentagon, and this is from Sean Parnell, the chief Pentagon spokesperson who's traveling with Pete Hegseth in the Western Pacific, and it says, and I quote, "It's no surprise hoax peddlers at the Atlantic have already abandoned their war plan claims. These additional signal chat messages confirm there was no classified materials or war plans shared. The secretary was merely updating the group on a plan that was underway and had already been briefed through the official channels. The American people see through the Atlantic's pathetic attempts to distract from President's national security agenda." So short of calling Jeffrey Goldberg anti-national, they've thrown a fair bit of abuse at him. But as I told you earlier, there are limitations to how much they can attack him. And you know what? Just where I was finally winding up, I see again that Donald Trump has now spoken on the Vince show, one of his favorite shows, where he has said, he's admitted that somebody on my team screwed up, or it's a bad signal. That's about as far as you can see Donald Trump going. At which point I have to really draw the line, because there are deadlines and I don't want this going into early morning tomorrow, because all of this is breaking out in America and it is very challenging to work on two completely different time zones and yet keep everything current.